I thought it would be nice if we started with something quick and easy and simple, like God. In particular, I don't believe there is one, and I have no idea what your thoughts are on it.
You mean on the fact that you don't believe there is one?
I mean just about the subject in general, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts on about what I don't think as well, maybe.
Well, it's a complicated problem, and I don't think that we take it with due seriousness. I specifically don't think that the celebrity atheist types, who I actually have a fair bit of respect for, by the way, take it with due seriousness. So I don't think that they take it with due seriousness from a biological perspective or a phenomenological perspective or a literary perspective or a metaphoric perspective. That'll do for starters. I've become convinced that the fundamental presuppositions of our very functional cultures, or Western cultures say, are nested immovably in a metaphorical substrate. And that when you enter that metaphorical substrate, you're in the domain of religious phenomenology. And I think that not only can you derive that conclusion as a consequence of deep philosophical thought and literary analysis, but that if you know enough about brain function, you'll also come to the same conclusion. I think you come to the same conclusion as well if you look at the evolution of religious cognition from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist and not from the position of an evolutionary biologist whose head is addled by the belief that most of human morality was established in the 500 years since the Enlightenment. So that's a start, I guess.
Except, and so you have to bear with me,
Yeah,
because I'm from Texas.
that's okay. I'm from Alberta, you know. It's bigger than Texas, just as bad.
Yeah. So the curious thing for me is all of that applies seemingly, if I'm understanding it, to religious thought, religious tradition, the value of religious identity to individuals. And I don't see that any of it relates to whether or not there is a God or whether or not there's sufficient reason to believe there's a God, which is my sticking point. I'm fully fine with the idea, we'll try and get through this without, like, raucous applause, but, hey, at least I got one.
Yeah, you don't never complain about raucous applause.
Because that's the sticking point for me. I have no problem acknowledging that people derive value from their beliefs, whether or not they map to anything in reality, that they can be inspired and motivated, educated, and enlightened by poetry, prose, metaphor, allegory. But my concern is, having grown up a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, the people who I know and some of the people who are working to enact legislation on behalf of their beliefs are convinced that they have good reason to believe that there actually is a God, not just that it's useful to them.
Well, it's not that easy to distinguish between what's useful and what's real. So I think that distinction can be made, but it's a lot more difficult than people generally think. And I also think that there's no doubt that there are different levels of sophistication of religious belief. What I see happening in this sort of discussion, say frequently, and again, like I said, I have a fair bit of respect for the atheist types because they spend a lot of time thinking, and that's generally a good thing. I see most of their thinking, however, directed at the fundamentalist types, the fundamentalist Christian types, mostly of the American persuasion, who suffer from the somewhat understandable illusion that the biblical corpus has the same epistemological and ontological status as a scientific theory, when it clearly doesn't, right? I mean, if you're...
Okay, now we're closer to the same page.
Okay,
yeah.
If you're a religious thinker, let's say, if you're a serious student of religious thought and a serious philosopher, one of the things you can't claim is that whatever story the Bible is telling is a scientific theory. And that's just self-evident. First of all, like, when was the first scientist? Descartes, Bacon, Newton? Maybe you could chase it back to the Greeks, but no farther than that. And so the idea that whatever the people who conjured up the Old Testament creation account were doing was something akin to scientific theorizing is a mistake that would only be made by people who don't know how to distinguish between different kinds of truth. And so the fundamentalists, like, I feel for the fundamentalists, you know, because what they're trying to do, to give them credit, is to maintain a corpus of stories in which an ethos is based. That would be the Western ethos, in this case of Christianity, because they believe that the ethos is of extreme value. And I also believe that the ethos is of extreme value and that it is nested in those stories. And so they don't like to be confronted by the rationalist, atheist, evolutionary types because it blows the foundation of their ethos apart and they feel that it's worth preserving. And I think, well, yeah, it is worth preserving. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't philosophical problems associated with the manner in which they construct their arguments. But, well,
what I'd like
they're
is
still worthy. But it doesn't address the issue. There's a deep issue here that we're not contending with. You know, here's an example. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think so. I just finished. Well, I thought about it a lot, you know, and I do try to think about where I'm wrong because I would like to figure out where I'm wrong because then I wouldn't have to be wrong anymore, right? And being wrong is actually not a good thing. You fall into a pit if you're wrong.